All right, so this week's Parsha is called Tetzaveh, which means, and you shall command. All right, and it continues from last week. Last week's Parsha was all about the building of the Mishkan, or the tabernacle. This week's Torah portion starts by talking about the menorah, so it's still talking about things inside the Mishkan, inside the tabernacle, but then it kind of shifts gears and begins talking about the high priest and the priesthood, and specifically spends a tremendous amount of time talking about the garments that are to be made for the priest to wear. Now, it is curious because we read in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, a verse that says, "You are to keep my statutes. You are not to breed together two kinds of cattle. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor wear a garment upon you of two kinds of material mixed together." Now, it was interesting because in the last group, I was talking about the laws of kosher. We're talking about keeping kosher. And one of the things that I brought up was the fact that part of the laws of kosher is the fact that we are not allowed to create hybrids or crossbreeds. In fact, I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think the blueberry or something like that was actually created, not by God, but by man. I think it's a crossbreed of two different types of berries or something like that. So Jews are actually forbidden by the Torah to create such things. Now, some people won't eat them, but most rabbis have ruled that even though we're not allowed to create them, once they're created, it's fine. With animals, it's a little different because no crossbreeding of animals has ever produced a kosher animal, right? We have the laws which tell us what is kosher and what isn't. But the thing that I want to focus on is that it says that you shall not wear a garment upon you of two kinds of material mixed together. Now, in this particular verse, it says two kinds of material, but we know that it's specifically from another verse talking about linen and wool. Okay, so you can have cotton and wool, you can have cotton and synthetics, not a problem, but specifically the combination of wool and linen are forbidden to be woven together in clothing. And in fact, it says also in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, chapter 22, verses 9 through 11, "You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, or all the produce of the seed which you have sown, and the increase of the vineyard will become defiled. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear a material mixed of wool and linen together. You shall make yourself tassels on the four corners of your garment, with which you cover yourself." Now, there are loads and loads and loads and loads of comments regarding the juxtaposition of the verse that's talking about not mixing wool and linen together and the verse about the tzitzit, the fringes, because the original tzitzit were actually wool and linen strings together. All right. So put that on hold for a second. The idea of not mixing species or not crossbreeding or not creating hybrid plants is called kilayim in Hebrew. And in fact, there's a whole Mishnah devoted just to the topic of kilayim. Oddly enough, it's called kilayim. But anyway, the word which is used specifically about wool and linen mixed together in a garment is the word shatnez, okay? And it's not originally, I don't think it originates from Hebrew, although it is a word in Hebrew now. And the Mishnah, in the Mishnah, it says that the word shatnez is actually an acrostic of three words, which are translated combing, twisting, and spinning. But the modern Hebrew word shatnez simply means a mixture. Okay, so we have this commandment in the Torah, which hasn't actually been given yet because we're still in Shemot, and the commandment is later. But we have this commandment in the Torah which prohibits the mixing of wool and linen. Okay, so that seems pretty clear. Why bring it up? Because here in this week's Parsha, we read in verse 5 and 6, and they shall take the gold, the blue, the purple, the crimson, and crimson wool and linen, and they shall make an ephod of gold, blue, purple, and crimson wool and twisted fine linen, the work of a master weaver. This is part of the instructions for creating the garments that the priest, or the high priest specifically, is supposed to wear. So now, how is it that one of the negative commandments given in the Torah is not to mix wool and linen, and yet the holiest garment to be made, that which will clothe the high priest himself, is to be made precisely of that which we are forbidden from doing later on in the Torah, right? It's a question that has to be asked. In addition, like I said, the tzitzit, the fringes that a Jewish man wears, were originally white strands of linen knotted together and wrapped with blue strands of wool. So how can that be? Well, first of all, we have to understand that this commandment is one of many commandments which is classified as a chok. Okay, the Hebrew word chok, which means a law, okay, but a chok is specifically a law which is given without any explanation. It simply is, all right? So imagine for a minute your husband, one day he comes along and he asks you to do something, right? And he says, I can't tell you why, although I have a really good reason, but will you just trust me on this, please? How would you respond? And if you're not married, think about a sibling, think about your best friend, whatever. Somebody that you have a very close relationship with, and they come up to you and they say, look, I need you to do whatever. And I can't explain why. I have my reasons, but I can't tell you why. Just do me a favor and trust me. All right? How would you respond? I mean, I suppose that partly depends on what kind of a track record this person has, right? I mean, if he's always been faithful throughout your marriage and he's done nothing but show you that he loves you and wants the best for you and is completely trustworthy, you would say yes, right? Whether we're talking about a husband or we're talking about a sibling or we're talking about a good friend, whether or not you would trust them with no questions asked is going to depend on the track record that you have with them. In the same way, there are some laws that God has given the Jewish people, and he says to us, do you love me? Do you trust me? Just do what I ask. I have my reasons, but I also have my reasons why I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to explain it to you. Just trust me, okay? And we have to stop and say, okay, does God have a track record with me of being trustworthy? Does God have a track record with me of showing me that he loves me? And if you're honest, the answer has to be yes. But the sages explain that it is possible that some laws were given without an explanation in order that we wouldn't find some reason to try to change it. For example, we're forbidden from eating pig, right? No explanation is given as to why, all right? We're just forbidden from eating it, right? That really applies to all of the kosher animals. It explains what makes them kosher and what makes them not kosher, but it doesn't explain why we're allowed to eat those and not these. What difference does chewing its cud make? What difference does a split hoof make? What difference in the fish does scales and fins make? We can try to come up with our own reasons, but that's a problem because the sages explain that part of the reason that no explanation was given is because then we would try to change it. For example, with the example of the pig, some people have tried to explain that it's because pork contracts a bacteria called trichinosis, right? Very easily. And since it makes people very sick, God doesn't want us to eat it. It's a dirty animal. The meat will make us sick. And so we're not supposed to eat it. The problem with this line of reasoning, of course, is that God never told us that that's why we're forbidden from eating it. And to make such an assumption is problematic, because what if science were suddenly able to create a breed of pig that doesn't contract this bacteria, right? Some might reason that it would be allowed, right? If you have it in your head that the reason that God said no to this animal was because it will make you sick, if science were able to create or cause the animal to not make you sick anymore, you might follow the line of reasoning that, oh, now it's okay, right? And that kind of falls in line, I think, with a lot of the people who say that the Torah is obsolete today. It doesn't hold any weight anymore because we live in a different world than the world that the Torah was written in. And it's not true. God gave these laws, and the rabbis discourage us from trying to figure out why commandments without reasons were given, so that we don't take that extra leap and try to figure out why. And so we must simply acknowledge that they were given and that God knows what he was doing. All right. So that's what a chok is. A chok is a law that has no explanation along with it. It simply is a law that was given to us. We just have to do it. And, maybe we could figure out why God told us to do it. Maybe not, but we're not supposed to try, because of the fact that then we start going down this like slippery slope towards trying to reason why it's now okay. All right. So this also holds true for this command of not combining linen and wool. No explanation is given as to why we're not allowed to mix linen and wool. Neither is there an explanation given as to why it's permitted to be mixed in these specific circumstances. However, our tradition does give us some insight into what they might represent, that it doesn't give us a reason why God gave us the law, but it does help us to see certain spiritual parallels and truths which give meaning to its observance. So, in Jewish thought, linen is said, which comes from the flax plant, right, is said to represent physicality, all right, this world. And wool is said to represent spirituality or the soul. Now, linen comes from the ground. It's connected directly to the earth, and it represents the earth and earthly pleasures and, like I said, physicality. There's nothing wrong with linen. God created linen, and he gave us the ability to be able to use it to create garments and other things. But it represents physicality. In the building of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the outer courtyard was surrounded by curtains of linen. It's our physical selves which houses and protects our spiritual selves in this world. Okay, so the body is like those linen curtains. It's the interface between who we really are, that's the internal stuff, and the world around us. All right, plants are alive, but they're not sentient. They don't think, and they don't feel, at least not in the way that animals do. I mean, I've heard claims that plants do react to certain types of waves and whatever, and maybe they feel pain in some way, but it's not the same way that animals do. Plants are not sentient. Wool is said to represent spirituality. Wool comes from a living being, an animal, and animals are sentient. And also, just an aside, we have, of course, the sheep and the goats, which are used as sacrifices in the temple. At Passover, it was the blood of a lamb that was put on the doorpost of the houses and was to be eaten that night. It was an act of obedience. So there are a lot of reasons why the wool is specifically associated with spiritual things, right? Animals have the next level of soul. Now, I'm not going to go through each of the garments that the priests wore, although it is interesting that the many of the undergarments were made of white linen, and as you get farther out, you have the white linen, and then you have this mixture of the crimson and purple and blue wool with gold and with linen. And then I'll get to that in just a second, but each of the garments that the Kohen wore had spiritual significance. Okay, so you can find an article, actually, if you're interested, on aish.com that explains the different garments and what they represent. But the belt and the apron, which were one level out, right? You had the undergarments, which were white linen, and then you had the belt and the apron, which the priest wore, which was made of red wool, purple wool, blue wool, and gold. All right, and these are also found on the covering of the tabernacle. So it is explained by Rabbi Hirsch that the red wool represents the animal level of soul. Okay, so you had the linen, which represents the plant level of soul. Okay, and then you have the red wool, which represents our animal soul, and then you have the purple wool, which represents the human level of the soul, and then you have the blue wool, which represents the godly aspect of the soul, right? That's what connects us to God, and that's what allows us to not only connect to the divine source, but also to be able to do good in this world and to draw God's presence down into the world. So in order for the priest to provide atonement for the soul and to facilitate that intimate relationship with God and man, he has to take the animal soul, right, in the human soul, and the godly aspects, the godly soul, basically, of who we are, and bind them together with a strand of pure gold, so to speak, which reminds us that in all of these things, the only way to approach God is in purity. So as we look at the garments that the priest wore, you had, like I said, the undergarments, which are made of white linen, and then you had these intermediary garments, which are woven a combination of these colored wools with gold and with linen. So it's bringing in the purity, it's bringing in the animal soul, the physicality, and it's also bringing in the different aspects of the spiritual self, right? And then under everything else, he's covered with a totally blue wool cloak. And that is all of the aspects of who we are, including the purity of our intentions, have to be immersed or cloaked in spirituality. All right. So that blue cloak that covers everything is really, that is the godly soul level. That is that level of spirituality. And we cannot, as human beings, intermingle the physical and the spiritual. Only God can do that. But we must completely envelop our physicality in the outer garment of spirituality. All right. I hope that makes sense. When we look at the tzitzit, right, what was the point of the tzitzit? It says in Bamidbar, in Numbers chapter 15, verses 38 through 41, "Speak to the sons of Israel and tell them that they shall make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and they shall put on the fringe of each corner a cord of blue. It shall be a tassel for you, or fringe for you, to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, so as to do them and not follow after your own heart and after your own eyes, after which you played the harlot, so that you may remember to do all of my commandments and be holy to your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God." All right. So the point of the tzitzit is to be a physical reminder that we serve God and that we must follow the commandments that he's given us, right? The original tzitzit were white strands of linen wrapped in a blue wool thread to remind us that although we live in a physical world, we are actually spiritual beings. And everything that we do in our physical daily life must be knotted up and must be enveloped in the reality of our spirituality and the fact that we are spiritual beings. We don't intermingle them, but we do envelop them.